welcome to Turn the Page, the official podcast of the Syosset Public Library.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Turn the Page. I'm your host, Jen, and I am joined today by an author, a publisher, an editor, a person who wears many hats of different varieties within the horror community. And it's really a great pleasure and an honor. So welcome to our show. Could I ask you to introduce yourself and your work, please?
Yeah, hi. My name is Caitlin Marceau. I've written a few books, magnum opus, palimpsest, but my most popular one, arguably, is This Is Where We Talk Things Out, the sequel coming out next year called All Roads Lead to Home. And yeah, I'm also one of the editor-in-chiefs, co-editor-in-chief more specifically, of Hedone Books. So really excited to be here. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. This is so great. We are at this show big horror fans. I am personally a huge fan of Hedone Books and of sort of the horror community in general. I feel like it's a really good time to be into horror right now.
Oh, yeah.
So before we get too much into newer stuff, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the beginning of your journey, your career, and sort of what led you to all this cool horror work.
Oh, cowardice.
Yeah.
You're unabashed cowardness. No, I've growing up, my grandfather, who passed away unfortunately last year, was a really big influence in terms of my love of reading and love of books, and specifically love of storytelling. So they were terrible stories. I have to preface this first. But he, when I was younger, would make these tailor-made stories for me. So I'd be like a little kid. He'd be like, what do you want? What are you ordering? And I'd be, I want something that has a dragon, but this dragon must love hats. That's a must. There has to be a princess, but she can't be saved. And I need 333 pumpkins. There is no wiggle room for that number. And he'd come up with a story that, again, I can't stress enough, not always good, but that fit these requirements. And it was just so fun and magical to watch him spin these yarns. And he was just a huge lover of reading and books. So just eventually I'm kind of competitive. I just wanted to be better than him. So I wanted to be able to tell a story that he would find fascinating, and that would sort of hit all those requirements. And so that's sort of where my love of it came. And then as for horror, I actually had a lot of nightmares and night terrors and sleep paralysis growing up. I was a coward. There is, I don't know if it was as big in the States, but in Canada, there was this show called Lunette the Clown. And I had nightmares about Lunette the Clown and her adorable little Molly doll, because she had a little doll named Molly. And I was a fan of them until I had a nightmare. And then suddenly I couldn't watch this made for children's program. So I avoided horror my whole life until high school, when I ended up going over to a friend's sleepover, and everyone was watching fear.com. It was one of those really mid-level.
That would be that's the detail for the period piece, about
yeah. That's it. It was fear.com, and I was shitting my pants. Excuse my French. But I was so scared, and everyone else was having the time of their life. And I decided that I was just tired of being afraid of everything. So I ended up kind of overcorrecting, I think. Just sort of fell in love with it after watching everything I could get my hands on. So yeah, weird villain origin story.
That's awesome. And that is very relatable too, because I was also a very scared kid. But then I just sort of, ended up horseshoe theory on the other side, super into horror. I guess if exposure therapy works really well, you just get really into it. Yeah.
That's it.
So I'd love if we could talk a little bit about Hedone Books and its mission, because it's publishing such cool stuff. And I'd love to know about, your origins and, how you go about selecting projects or curating them.
Oh man, yeah. No, I'm really proud to be part of this team. I am extraordinarily lucky to be working with Malcolm Azure, who's the co-EIC of Hedone, and some of the authors we have. Well, all of the authors we have are absolutely brilliant. when it comes to putting these projects together and curating the books that we have coming out, I want to say that there's some sort of like master plan, but we have just been very lucky. Like I can't stress that enough. We knew what our vision was. So we had originally actually planned on having a Kickstarter and trying to do that this fall to sort of, because our goal is to try to make publishing more accessible, I suppose is the best way of phrasing it, where we really want it to be, specifically when it comes to like horror erotica, dark romance, sort of, outskirts of the romance and horror genres, they sometimes have quite a large barrier to entry, I find, either in terms of like people stigmatizing the material, or in my personal experience, finding a lot of material that isn't necessarily like queer centric. It's a lot of like cis het relationships, and that's not always what readers want, right? Especially if we're leaving out a huge demographic. So that was sort of our goal, to kind of get into that space, make it more accessible to everyone, sort of, share these narratives that aren't necessarily being told. And it's been really wonderful to watch sort of these people resonate with the stories that are coming out. But originally, to sort of pick our authors, we kind of reached out to a couple of writers that we knew had works that would fit the bill, but hadn't quite been picked up by other publishers yet. They've been kind of shopping them around, or they had a short story, like Lindsay McLeod's Sunbathers started off as a short story. And so she really wanted to sort of play in that sandbox a little bit more and expand it. And we were like, please, please devastate us. And she has. So we've just been very tremendously lucky to work with such great writers. And we're hoping to have submissions open to novels and novellas next year. So that's also very exciting for us.
Oh, that is exciting.
Yeah.
Yes. Sunbathers was phenomenal. We were just talking before the show that I interviewed Lynn's a couple of weeks ago. That episode just came out today, actually. And it is so good. It is so great. And like, it's just as like a sort of, if you were to pick it to represent like what Hedone is trying to do, it's just like, it's perfect. It encapsulates it.
I think so.
Yeah.
I'm very biased.
And, a question I posed to her that I would love to pose to you now is, why do you think like horror and the erotic work so well together? Because like my first instinct is just like transgression, right? Of different kinds,
Yeah.
right? But there's got to be more to it than that. So like, what is it about that intersection that was so appealing to you and your co-editors?
So I'll give you the sort of joke answer that I like to give everyone, but then I'll get serious, I promise. But I like to joke that everyone on some level is always horny and afraid. Like that's just, we're all like that.
That's true.
Everyone's horny and afraid.
Yeah.
But I think on like a more serious note, right? If we're going to look at it from sort of the two different genres, not necessarily the intersection of them yet, but if we look at romance and erotica, it really is all about sort of this fantasy fulfillment. If you are like, again, this is not always the best example, right? But if you are a housewife, you're in a monogamous relationship with your high school sweetheart that you've been married to for like 30 years, the idea of going out and, participating potentially in BDSM or an open relationship is not something that you yourself are going to actively want to participate in, but you might want to live vicariously through someone else's story and experience. There is kind of that like wish fulfillment without actually having to be an active participant in that activity. And I think a lot of that also goes very much hand in hand with horror. There's, people who are watching slashers don't actively want to be stalked. They don't, I hope, want to be brutally murdered. But there is something about sort of living vicariously through these characters and getting their heart rate up, and experiencing that fear that can be very overpowering. Similarly to reading erotica, right? You're getting these emotions, your heartbeat is going up, you're getting a little sweaty under the collar. And so I think there is something really fun about being able to kind of have that, like those experiences in tandem, because I think they strengthen each other, right? There is sort of that like release of like the romance and the erotica and sort of that safety, but then there's also like getting your heart rate up and having that fear and building that tension through the horror. I think it was Jordan Peele who actually spoke about how comedy and horror intersect so well, because there's something fantastic about having that levity and that those moments of safety where you can kind of like laugh and like relax a little bit, so that when the horror jumps out at you, it's suddenly even more frightening because you let your guard down. And that's kind of, I think, very similarly how, horror intersects with erotica and romance in the space, or that's our intention anyways.
That is so interesting. Yeah, like to put it very glibly, there is a lot of fear in love and a lot of love in fear, because we do
Oh
often
yeah.
love the things that we're afraid of. Like I love Freddy Krueger, even though he would kill me given the
Oh
choice.
yeah.
Yeah. So we've talked about sunbathers. I would love if you could talk a little bit more about what's coming up. In a little while, I think in a couple weeks, I'll be interviewing the authors of Flesh of the Sea. I'm very excited about that too. So
Yeah. Oh my gosh, Shelly and Laura, they're amazing. I cannot wait for you to meet them. They are like the sweetest humans I have ever had the joy of meeting. I think I say that about all the
yeah.
writers, but they're all such like tremendously wonderful people. Like Alison Hassan, her book Island of the Unclaimed just recently came out, and she's also just fantastic. Some of our upcoming titles include S.M. Hallow's How to Survive This Fairy Tale. It's a bit of an outlier for us in the sense that it isn't necessarily horror and it isn't necessarily erotic, but it is dark and kind of like has these really like just like eroticism in this text, even though I wouldn't necessarily classify it as horror or erotica. And that's a book that I'm tremendously excited for. And that's out in January 2025. We also have William Sterling's Dead Men's Chess that's coming out October 2nd. And pre orders for digital copies of this book are available now, with paperbacks, hopefully, Amazon being available next week. Amazon, get it together. So hopefully that is available soon. But yeah, we have a tremendous like number of authors. We have our schedule pretty much planned until the end of next year, which is exciting and terrifying. We have ZK Abraham, but ZK Abraham, Canadian. They're curating an anthology called Silicon Fox Club, which is all about like eco horror and the eroticism of like eco horror, and I'm very excited for next year. It's going to be crazy.
Nice. That's
Yeah.
awesome. And so in terms of your editing work, do you feel as though editing for a press, has it altered or inflected your own approach to writing or your own writing interests at all?
Yeah, it definitely has. It's made me more aware of what I like and what I dislike and why I like or dislike those elements. It's really hard when I'm reading my own work to sometimes put my finger on why something isn't really like jiving with me, or I'm like, oh, this in theory should be fine, but there's just something about the story that isn't really working for me. But when I'm reading someone else's story, when I'm kind of lost in the world that they've created and I'm not as trapped in my own headspace, it's a lot quicker for me to sort of figure out like, oh, okay, this isn't working because like this character isn't reacting in a way that I feel is believable, or one that doesn't necessarily feel believable based on what you've established for their character in the story, right? So that has definitely been kind of nice to see. I also have discovered that there are like certain things I really enjoy in fiction that I didn't realize I was really interested in. Like I always joke that I write a lot of, as Lindy Ryan coined the term, mama trauma, but I've discovered like more and more that I also love reading and writing stuff that involves a lot of like religious trauma. So that's fun and not triggering for people.
All this is so,
Yeah.
unladen with with me. So
Yeah.
charged. Yeah.
Yeah. Easy breezy topics.
Yep. That's cool. Yeah, and I imagine, when you are reading your own work with an editing eye, it must be difficult to establish or like tell the difference between like what is on the page that's evident to everybody and like what is also in your head that's informing your own reading. Whereas opposed to you're approaching somebody else's work, all you have is what's on the page. And so things are a bit more clear cut. Like,
oh yeah, no, because like I'm a meticulous planner, right? Like there are some people who are pantsters, and I Jesus take the wheel for you. I don't know how you do it. Best of luck. But I will like meticulously plan every story, every chapter. Like I will do more drafts of my outline than I do the actual text, because I feel like once I've worked through all of those plot holes and sort of like that character development, then it's just like the writing and syntax for me, or at least that's how my process is. And so sometimes when I'm going back and editing my own work, it's like, well, why didn't this work for someone? Because like obviously this character is going to do X, Y, Z. I can't imagine why this scene didn't really play out the way they were expecting it to, or in a way that they felt was authentic to the, to the story. And then when I'm reading someone else's work, I'm like, oh yeah, no, you didn't set any of this up. I have no idea what's happening here. So it's a lot more, it's just really a great kind of perspective, I think, on writing and editing and kind of getting out of your own head a bit, which I've got to do more of. I think.
It's really hard because, the job of being a writer just requires you to be alone in your own head a lot. So,
oh yeah.
And then the other part is like all publicity and being in front of people and like being, so you have to be like an extrovert and an introvert at the same time to kind of do this.
Yeah. There are two wolves inside me. One of them wants to be left alone deeply, and the other one also wants to be left alone, but is not allowed to be alone.
Yeah.
Both of them are awkward and uncomfortable, though. So that's something at least.
Wow. So you mentioned that there might be a sequel in the works for your most recent work. Are you working on it? Like, are you working right now? I know that people aren't always at liberty to talk about like what is in the works, but like what's on your horizon generally right now?
Ooh, so there are a couple of really fun things. Yeah, so the sequel to This Is Where We Talk Things Out, I had been planning it for a while. I debated, I'm not going to spoil the ending of the first one, but it really kind of has an ending that could go either way. Like I don't want to say it's a cliffhanger, but it's just really not. It's very ambiguous, I guess, in terms of like what happens to Miller, who is our protagonist. And so I really tossed and turned about whether or not I wanted to write a second one, but I really want to tell Florence's story. So that was her fiance, and I just really want to explore this. She's engaged, and then her fiance disappears, and she doesn't really know what happens to her. So I decided to kind of change points of view, and now I'm really focusing on like Florence's story and sort of the aftermath of what happens and how she has or hasn't moved on from the events of the first book. And it goes sideways as is sort of everything in horror, right? It always kind of goes pear-shaped, and that's kind of how it goes for her. And that's coming out. So tentatively it's scheduled for Mother's Day next year. Perfect. Yeah. Because the first book had such a 10 on 10 mom in it. So I thought it was appropriate to do a similar thing for the sequel, but we'll see. The deadline, like the release date isn't like set in stone, but I'm hoping everything will be still on track to come out Mother's Day. And then sooner than that, I have kind of working backwards on February 13th, so Galentine's Day, I have a sapphic pirate book coming out in the same sort of Dark Sail series. So I'm quite excited. It's really tragic and more depressing than it is horrific, but I'm hoping to still scare the pants off of some people. And then at the end of this year, actually, I have a new collection coming out called Loose Ends. So I'm really excited about that. It isn't announced yet, so you're actually the first person to hear about it.
Oh, wow. Oh, what an honor. Thank you. That's so exciting.
Breaking news.
Wow, those all sound great. Very interested in sapphic pirates. Sounds wonderful. I'm particularly curious about, just like when you are writing a sequel, when you go back to the original text, this is so abstract. Tell me if it makes sense, please. But are you trying to recapture what you found the first time, or are you trying to approach it with new eyes in order to see like what remains to be explored or expanded on?
So this is my first sequel. So granted, I'm very new to the sequel writing process. So This Is Where We Talk Things Out. So full disclosure, when I wrote it, I didn't expect it to sell. I didn't think anyone would want to publish it. I didn't think once it came out that people were going to really buy it, because it is fundamentally just a story about a mother and daughter who like are estranged and then try to reconnect, and it doesn't go well as expected. I think. And so like it ended up selling, I think it's like over 10,000 copies now. Like it sold a stupid amount that I, again, at the time was like, if I'm lucky, maybe my mom will buy this. Assuming I don't give her a free copy, which I did. She'll buy this, which she also did. So like, bless my parents. The two of them each bought a copy. They were all, but I really thought that was sort of where like the sales of that book were going to end. And so when it sold so many copies, I didn't want to write a sequel, because honestly, that's one of the things that really scared me, is how is this going to perform by comparison to the first one? And people do generally seem to really like the first one, especially that ending. And so I was really worried about going and like messing that up and ruining it. So approaching this sequel, again, being the first one that I've written, my goal isn't to necessarily recapture the same story as the first one because I don't want to just sort of regurgitate it, but I do want to capture a lot of the same themes because I feel like if you are writing a series, it does make sense to like have a bit of a thematic through line. So that is definitely one of the main themes. So I won't necessarily give, if I give it away, I don't want to like make people angry. So one of the main thematic through lines in the first book certainly carries over into the second one. But I'm hoping that by changing the point of view and really focusing more on Florence and not really talking like from Miller's point of view or really getting to see anything from Miller's, because like her story was like finished in the first book, in my opinion. This one really focusing on like what her fiance went through afterwards, to me will be, you know, it's still in the same universe. It's still a cohesive like duology, but I am hoping to have like a different story. So I know that was a very long-winded answer to say it's going to be different, but it's going to be different.
No, I think that's cool. I think, you know, I love a sequel that can expand the story while also kind of changing the way that you view the or originating story. That's the word I was looking for.
Yeah.
Yeah, that sounds great. I'm very excited for all of it. And, you know, thank you so much for coming to talk to us and our listeners. We are definitely going to be acquiring some of these for our collection, and I will be recommending these titles to our patrons. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Yeah, you're very welcome. All right, listeners, this is where I would usually, you know, suggest you go out and buy whatever book we are talking about. But we've talked about several books today, so go buy all of them. Is that?
Please buy all of them.
Yeah. So go buy all of them. Or
I need to pay rent.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much for joining us again. It is now time to close this chapter. Bye.
It's time to close this chapter of Turn the Page. Join us for the next episode.